Hey everyone, so a little bit different setup here for an Ask Drive Anything. Obviously not in the office for the reasons that you're all aware of. As we're going through these uncertain times, we're getting a lot more questions from portfolio companies and a lot of questions from people who aren't in the portfolio. And we wanted to take the information that we just shared with our portfolio companies and now share it with you so you have access to the same information. Essentially, in our experience, there are two types of CEOs who run into these crises. There are the vast majority of us who start looking at the data, start getting the news, they start rationalizing it. They start convincing themselves that this is not going to be a problem, that things might bounce back, I think if I cut my staff or I think about cutting revenue by 10%, that I can manage this crisis. And the reality is, in 2008, when people did that, the result was their company went away. And the reason for that is because as you start to get the data, as you start to get more information, it only comes in incrementally worse and worse and worse. And the challenge is, as every single increment starts to come down the line, by the time you get to the point where you say, oh my gosh, I need to really do something, it's too late because access to capital has dried up substantially, your burn rate is too high, and now you have no opportunity to fix it. Famously was coined by Doug Leone at Sequoia, who described this as the death spiral, where as you're incrementally getting closer and closer and closer, you don't realize that you're even in the death spiral. If you over prepare now, if you over decide, if you over correct now, the cost of doing so is relatively minimal when you consider that the alternative is you gradually discover that you've gone out of business and all of your companies and all of your customers and all of your employees and all of your investors have fled and you're out and your company goes away. So what are the steps you can actually do? We put together an email that we sent out to our portfolio companies that gave them a set of recommendations that we saw from the last crisis. This is a list that we've seen both from our experience and also the experiences of other people. First and foremost, in times like this, you have got to over communicate. You've got to over communicate with your team. You've got to communicate with your investors, your board. The best companies right now in our portfolio are having a daily communication where it's either an email or a Slack channel or an all hands over Zoom, whatever it is. The temptation is often to hide in the corner and lock yourself in an office and try and figure it out. The reality is you need to be in front of this. Your team needs to see you dealing with this crisis and running at it. The second thing you need to do is you need to recognize in this crisis, one thing is very, very different than it was the last time around, which is we can't work in our offices. And it sounds trivial, but the reality is there's nothing more frustrating to your team than trying to find solutions for a crisis and feeling like they just can't talk to each other. It's so important and so crucial. So invest in your systems, invest in Zoom, try out Google Hangouts, try whatever your system is. Make sure that everyone is up and running and set up to be successful as they go through these things. The third thing you need to do is you need to stress test your company. What do we mean by this? This is not a scenario where what if we don't hit 10% of what if we just do 90% this year? That's not the right analysis. It's not severe enough. The analysis that you need to run right now is take the recurring revenue that you have this month. So not all revenue is created equally, but take the recurring revenue that you have this month, cut it by 1/3, take it down by 33%, and then assume that that's all the revenue you're going to have on a monthly basis. Then look at your expenses and try and understand, do I have enough balance sheet to survive this for the next 18 months? We say 18 months because every time we've looked at the analysis, 18 months is the longest that we've seen the capital markets close up and to think that you'll have access to additional capital. So if you run that analysis and it says that you have 18 months or more, I think you can assume that you've got a lot of maneuvering room here and you don't need to do anything drastic. If you're in the camp where most of our portfolio was, frankly, and you're in a position where you don't have the 18 months under that scenario, then you need to start making adjustments. Now, how do you make those adjustments? Well, there's a couple of things you can do, but it goes back to the first point. If you're over communicating with your board and over communicating with your investors, you're going to have options that will start to emerge and become available to you. Okay, now that you've run your stress test and you've started to figure out how much runway do I have, no matter how long it's said that you have, you need to increase it by as much as you can. A lot of companies have access to debt capital on the front end of a crisis where we are right now, and then you'll see that start to vanish as banks start to pull down lines of credit. They start to take them away. They start to limit your access to them. They put covenants in place. So one of the very first things that we recommend companies do is if you have access to a line of credit, pull it down now. Don't pull down 10%, 15, 20, 50%. Pull the whole thing down now. I know that there's a cost of borrowing it. I get it. But the incremental cost of borrowing that capital versus your access to that capital is remarkably in your favor if you pull it down. And the de minimis amount of interest that you might pay will pale in comparison to your ability to have the time you need to maneuver around this crisis. There's a book that I read when I was in college. It was written by a squash coach, and he coined this phrase of run to the roar. And the theory is that if you hear the roar of a lion, the lion is always moving. The lion is roaring and driving you into a place where it wants you to be, which is to say that as the lion is moving, after it roars, it's in a new spot. So if you run to the place that the lion roared from, that's the only place that you are guaranteed to not run into the lion. Now, that's an incredibly scary thing for any of us to do. And what does this mean for a business? What this means is if you've got big customers or you've got big investors or you've got lenders or you've got anybody who's crucial to your business, you need to go talk to them. You need to proactively get in front of them and you need to call them every single day and you need to make sure that everything is okay. No matter how bad the message is that comes from them, it's way better to proactively go out and get it as soon as you can, as opposed to waiting and getting surprised at a later point when you might not have predicted that was going to happen, and the result being that now you're blindsided and you have fewer opportunities for you to deal with this. Another piece of advice we offer is any bad news that you get, you got to share it and share it with everybody inside of your company. You don't necessarily need to tell all your customers, but you need to communicate it with your board, you need to communicate with your employees, and you need to communicate it with your lenders. And if you're doing this, what you're doing ultimately is you're building trust that as a management team, you're running into a situation with all the information and you're accessing the best minds. Think of it as, if you don't tell anybody this is a problem, now it's your problem. You have to deal with it on your own. If you share this problem with everybody around you, you make it our problem. And you're going to access far more brain power that's going to give you an opportunity to come up with solutions to this. The challenging thing about this is, as you're starting to go through this, the news gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And there's going to be a period of time where every day you open up the papers and you're emailing and you're getting incrementally worse and worse information. If you've done the first step and you've gone all the way to cutting your burn and you've given yourself as much room as possible and you've assumed the worst, you've probably gotten to a place where those draconian assumptions will actually be worse than what you're learning about. And so now getting this news, although it's bad, if you've run ahead of it, you're now, as this news starts to come your direction, it's still better than what you had assumed. And you're actually going to build confidence with everybody else around you and open yourself to more opportunities. The next thing is you need to pause all hiring. The economic impact is going to affect just about every single company. So don't convince yourself that, hey, I actually think this crisis could be good for my company. If you've seen it in the last 30 days, a massive increase in revenue or a reduction in cost because of the nature of your business is what it is, then you know what? That's awesome. Congratulations. But for the 99% of us who are either looking at our projections compared to the plans over the last 30 days and feeling like, hey, they're about where I thought they would be, you need to know that this is just a delayed reaction. Like this is coming for you, and you've got to assume the worst. The last piece of advice is probably the most important piece of advice, which is as you're in this period as a CEO, you need to be a different kind of leader. So a lot of us want to get more information and a lot of us want to get better data. You want this to be perfect. The reality is right now, perfection is the enemy of good, and good is going to be good enough to get you through this crisis. The absolute worst thing you can do is to hesitate. The companies where we see people hesitating and running more analysis, you're still burning. You're still in the crisis. It's going to be terrible. Versus the CEOs who are migrating more to a wartime, a general kind of CEO, are the ones who are successful. Now, that's a really easy thing for me to tell you here. The reality is, and we've already done this, and I've already made some mistakes at Drive, where as you're going along and you're running into these decisions and they're more uncertain than ever, they're also more costly than ever. You need to kind of calibrate yourself as a CEO that you still have to make decisions. And you need to know that those decisions are going to be more costly. And you need to know that that's okay, because otherwise you're going to find yourself in a scenario where the information hasn't gotten any better It just took you longer to make that same decision. And now you're in a position where you have fewer options and your company is a far worse place. The positive side of this is that the companies who make these kinds of adjustments now are making their businesses stronger than they've ever been before. And these recessions start to accelerate any trends. So if you're in a business, you were taking share from incumbents, in a recession, it's going to accelerate your opportunity to continue to take share from those incumbents. And especially as you come out the other side, there are going to be opportunities. So our advice in these situations is not to panic, make the necessary moves, and set your company up to be incredibly successful on the backside of it.